The cold, dark waters of the Atlantic pass beneath you. Sea spray spots your face. Your breath puffs in front of you. Suddenly, an alarm blares throughout the ship. Periscope sighted, action stations. You rush to your post as the ship rocks with a colossal impact. Hit. That is something like what went through my mind when I got to play Battleships when I was 5. My dad had a copy of Discovery of the Bismarck, which filled my mind with ideas of what a battleship should be, what it could be, all those beautiful pictures, those stories. It rooted itself deep in my imagination. So when I got my hands on Battleships with all its gubbins and printed on dials, I was so excited to live out my ideas of battleship combat. To take to the high seas and do battle against other armoured lords of war. I wanted to play the role of a battleship captain. Welcome to the first episode of Everything's a Role-Playing Game. Almost. I'm Matt, engineer, naval warfare lover, and gamer. In this series, I'm going to look at game theming, the mechanics of the games, how that interacts with the theming, and then how in turn they are perceived by us and pop culture. In this episode, I'm going to show you Battleship. Partially because I want an excuse to get hold of these two objects, but also because it's a terrible game. Look at it, you put your ships down. At no point in the game do you make a different decision because of what your opponent does. It's all based on that original grid. Sure, there's a little bit of bluffing and mind games, but not enough to make it an interesting component of the game, like in poker. You just run through whatever guessing strategy you have. Perhaps you change your strategy based on the known habits of your opponent. Perhaps you don't. There are algorithms for perfect play, and they aren't hard to remember. And that's what hurts me so much about this game. It's strongly themed, especially in the version I had as a kid, but the mechanics and the theming, they don't interact at all. And also the mechanics are bad. So bad, just to be clear. And yet this game, it's so prominent in popular culture. So prominent that Hasbro, officially the owners of Battleship, decided that they would make a movie based on it. Notice how much like the game it was? So, how did this game become themed as it was, and why am I talking about it at all? There are a number of theories about where Battleships comes from. The first hard and fast records of the game begin in the 1930s, primarily already with its naval theme. This was under the name Salvo. This was a pen and paper game. You got printouts of the grids and filled them in instead of the peg-based system we're more familiar with now. In Salvo you got 5 shots per turn instead of 1, but primarily it's the same rules. Interestingly, at the time there were also aviation-themed games, so it seems that designers thought even then that the game wasn't perfect for a naval theme. The origins of Battleships are supposed to be somewhat earlier. At the time of Salvo's launch, it was reported in a Milwaukee newspaper that this game was based on a pen and paper game played by Russian soldiers in World War I. Others have suggested that it's based on the game L'Attaque, but when you go look at L'Attaque, you find it is essentially what we know as Stratego. If you're at all familiar with Stratego, you know it's nothing like Battleships, other than having hidden knowledge of what's on a grid. But it has pieces you move around to attack other pieces. It's nothing like Battleships at all. Even so, L'Attaque, Stratego, they're themed after land armies, particularly the military ranks. So that doesn't explain where the nautical theme came from, even if it did explain the mechanics. Others have suggested the game Balisandra, and I can see that becoming Battleships. You play with a hidden grid with soldiers and cannons. You set up your side, you remove the screen. If your cannons pointed at enemy soldiers, they get kablammed. Put the screen back, replace your dead soldiers with soldiers from the reserve, move your cannons around, and so on. It's reasonably similar. If you played Balisandra and you want to create a pen and paper version of this, perhaps if you're off at war and you don't have a board, I can see you getting something very similar to Battleships. You know, the research about the origins of Battleship is really quite variable. You'll even find half-cocked articles that claim the game Broadsides is part of the Battleship family tree. It's not. In Broadsides, ships can move. They're not hidden from the opponent. And they're sail ships. Literally, the only thing that's the same is it's played on a grid. But only 1, not 4. And it has boats. Honestly, did no one actually go and check the rules of these games? Check your sources, people. Honestly, the sheer lack of intellectual rigor is just... In 1967, Milton Bradley enters the scene with a masterful twist. It replaces the pen and paper game with a real board. This is where that peg system that we're familiar with emerges. Over the next few years, with television adverts and newspaper articles, and the famous line, "You sunk my battleship," this game became seared into popular culture. This game is now only called Battleship or Battleships, despite there being countless names up to this point. That is testament to the strength of Milton Bradley's campaign to sell Battleship. And it succeeded despite the fact that the largest vessel in most games is the aircraft carrier, not the eponymous battleship. To be fair, aircraft carrier doesn't quite have the same ring to it. However, flat top, a nickname for aircraft carriers, sounds great. Unfortunately, that's taken. Flat top and its spiritual successor, Scratch One Flat Top, are also double-blind games. You don't know where your opponent is, you have to maneuver your fleet based on guesswork and instinct. I wanted to get Scratch One Flat Top as well, but that still doesn't actually explain how we got the game themed after battleships. Milton Bradley took the game that was already naval themed and put them in these lovely game sets with the little pieces and the pegs and little model ships that are printed on dials that really sell the idea of being at a missile console at sea, once you forget the mechanics, obviously. The thing is, in the 1930s, or even earlier in the trenches, nothing stands out to you about these mechanics that's battleship-esque. I do have one idea, though. In 1906, the Royal Navy launched HMS Dreadnought. So advanced was Dreadnought that it rendered obsolete everything that came before it. One of the key improvements brought together on Dreadnought was its fire control system. Firing solutions were fed to Dreadnought's main guns from fire directors. Each shot would be reported as a hit or a miss, and if it was a miss, by how far. The solution would be updated, sent to the guns again, and the next salvo taken. This was all in a drive to make gunfire more accurate at longer ranges. By World War II, battleships could score hits on moving targets up to 11 miles away, double that against static land-based targets. Perhaps it was some version of this process that those early board game designers were trying to emulate. This Dreadnought fever is one of my best guesses for how Battleship came to be themed this way. But there's always the possibility that someone just themed it on a fluke and it caught on. Perhaps the original version was land-themed. It definitely resembles the process of trying to find your opponent's big guns before your own big guns are knocked out. In that way, you really can see how the game directly evolved from Balisandre. Maybe in the 1930s, when the makers of Salvo were trying to sell their game, they knew that an artillery-themed game wouldn't sell very well in a world where almost everyone had a loved one who had been killed by a shell. So maybe they looked elsewhere and found the battleship. Naval power was powerful and evocative back then. It was largely detached from the horrors of the trenches in the First World War. My own experiences show that battleships still hold that power to mesmerise and inspire. It's very easy to forget that these machines are weapons of war and that when they're destroyed, they take hundreds, if not thousands of lives to the bottom with them. Battleships, the game, has endured into this modern age, even if the vessels that inspired it have been left in the past. The few survivors, relics of another age. And yet Battleships is still advertised as the game of naval combat. And yet we've shown that the only link to naval combat is tenuous. And that's what enraged my younger self, and apparently my older self, so much. This game makes promises with its theming, and it fails to deliver on them. There are other games that aren't particularly good simulations, but their mechanics are fun. They lead to an enjoyable game. I would actually include Ticket to Ride in that category, a game we'll look at in a later episode. Battleships fails to deliver on those promises. It doesn't feel like you're a battleship captain, tensely hunting down an opposing battleship. It leans hard into roleplay-like theming, at least in my version, but it delivers a very abstract game. So what are we to make of this? Have I failed in the first episode to prove that everything is a role-playing game? Is the first game that I look at actually going in the almost category? No. Because whilst Battleship, to my eye, seems to fail to deliver on that theme of being a battleship captain, playing that role, a large part of its success relied on that theming. An otherwise meh abstract strategy game with poor interaction has been made a pop culture icon, to the point where if you ask anyone for a game about naval warfare, they'll say Battleships. It really is trying to be a very confined role-playing game. It's just bad at it when you look under the surface. But here at Hoopsnick, we're not just the casual observer. Oh no, dear viewer, we make stuff. So how do I make Battleships better? And how do I do it on the same board with the same pieces as the original? Here's what I propose. We lean a little bit more into the fire control system I mentioned earlier. We play with one ship at a time, and when you launch a shot at me, if it's a miss, I have to tell you how far away your shot fell. After you've found out whether your first shot was a hit or a miss, you get to take a second on this turn. Then it's my turn. I get to move. I can either move my ship 2 squares in the direction it's facing, or spin it 90 degrees about its front. Then I get to shoot back. Each ship still has as much health as it does squares, but larger ships cover more of the board. They're easier to hit. You get to pick which ship you sail first, but you have to tell your opponent what it is. This represents the report of a ship sighted. Once it's sunk, you pick your next vessel until either you or your opponent has run out of ships. This immediately gives you more choices. Which ship do you pick first? Small vessels that take up less of the board, or big ships that cause havoc with ranging when they turn, suddenly moving their rear 5 squares? This game is still simple. It still retains the core of trying to find your opponent's battleship, but it gives a little bit more of a feel of desperately trying to find a firing solution whilst preventing your opponent from finding their own. Or, you know, you could just play Captain Sonar.